Good. So we're live. Tom, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
No, we're really looking forward to having this conversation. And yeah, you may hear absolutely nothing in the background behind me. It's a fantastic day in the Smith household. The kids have started school, which has been a long time coming.
I was expecting to hear screaming in that sort of short silence that you put there, and it's just blissful peacefulness. It means I can get on with doing some productive work. It's been an incredible experience, hasn't it? Having them around and appreciating what teachers go through on a day-to-day basis. And it just ratified the fact that I can never, ever go into teaching. I haven't got the patience, particularly with my own kids.
It's such a challenge. Yeah, my wife has done a far better job than I have, and I think ever could. So credit to her. Yeah, Jerry, I've been wanting to catch up with you since the weekend where you've just finished a pretty epic motorbike trip.
Yeah, it's been great, Reece. It's funny when you talk about a change of scenery with the kids going back to school. I was lucky enough to do this thing called the Great Mallee Rally last week, which is a motorcycle rally. Although it's not a race, you have to get there in the most appropriate time from Lizard Point, so most southern tip of England, to the Castle of May, which is a Prince's Trust castle right on the northern tip of Scotland. So one end of mainland Great Britain to the other, and it's a holiday apparently. But I've come back with all symptoms of swollen hands and sore fingers that we used to come back from deployments and exercises in the military. But just a fantastic experience of meeting new people, and we say it was from Lizard Point to the Castle of May, but it was from "Hi, my name's Jerry, nice to meet you," to "Hey, let's catch up again some other time." And you really, just by meeting new people, and it links very closely, as Reece knows, to the charity raising I do for the Distinguished Gentleman's Ride in November, because it's all we've really got a problem with men's mental health at the moment, and starting conversations is a great way of just identifying those very first steps to maybe save a life, and who knows. So it was a fantastic event, Reece. Yeah, so nice to be back, nice to be in a warm house,
Yeah,
with a warm cup of coffee and a bath, but I'd definitely go do it again. Yeah.
very good. And the gentleman's ride is happening when?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. 27th of September. Normally en masse across 400 cities across the world, people get together and put bow ties and tweed jackets on and ride very clean motorcycles around, trying to raise awareness for the November Foundation. Obviously, we can't do that this year, so the idea is that we're riding solo together. So just in case you see lots of idiots dressed up in tweeds riding motorcycles around and waving at you on the 27th of September, it's for a very good cause, but you won't see very large groups this year. That's the theory. I have a feeling people are probably going to get together and do stuff as well. So it's yeah, really good event, really nice charity and great people.
It's a fantastic charity, and you'll publish that on LinkedIn, and there'll be links and everything to sponsor you.
I will. Yeah.
Good. Well, Tom Williams, great to have you on the show. You and I first met at a Harlequins business event, I think about 18 months ago. And since we first met, and hearing your story, what you went through and what you're doing now, it's just absolutely fascinating. So thrilled that you could join us for this conversation today. There'll be lots of people who know the story, perhaps just bits of it. There'll be lots of people who don't know the story. Before we get to the Bloodgate story itself, when did you first realize that you wanted to be a professional rugby player?
God, that's a really good question, but I can't pinpoint exactly. But I think I realised that I had an ability which had potential. At about sort of 14 or 15, I realised that I was very capable as a sportsman and less capable in the classroom. So at that point, I thought, right, well, let's make a good fist of this. And there were some setbacks along the way. So in what would have been about 99 or 2000, the system at the time in England was that you went through the county system before going on to play regional, and then England, hopefully, if you go through that route. Now, I didn't get into my county. Luckily enough, I had sort of some Welsh heritage, or unlucky, depending on who you are.
You're very lucky to have
very
Welsh
lucky,
heritage.
sorry, Reece, yeah, very lucky.
I'm not going to have a majority argument on this on here.
And I had very willing parents and grandparents who drove me down to West Wales every Sunday to go and train with the Welsh down there. And as a result, one thing led to another. And over the course of the following 3 years, my last 3 years at school, it sort of just all fell into place. And I went and looked at a couple of universities and applied to a couple of universities, but never with the intention or seriousness of actually going there and studying. I think if I had gone, I'd been one of those guys who'd repeated the first year 3 or 4 times and then gone to work in a bank anyway. So that would have been me. I was not mentally mature enough at that point to have gone to uni. So I was rather fortuitous, but I fell into professional rugby and had the ability to stick at it for a period of time.
And can you remember the first time running out at Quins?
I can remember the second team game I played vividly. It was away at Saracens. I think it might have been an old Albanian rugby club around sort of Hertford Way, St Albans Way, I should say. And I looked up and I saw my opposite men. And in the second row, there was Abdul Benazi, French international, about 22 stone and 6'8". And next to him was Craig Quinnell, who was even bigger. And I thought, as they were running towards me, having made a line break, I was sort of questioning my decision-making process. Fast forward 2 years to when I made my debut against Natal Sharks at the Stoop, because they used to come over once a year in their pre-season, and we used to have a game. And I was lying on the floor and put the ball back illegally. And AJ Fenter goes, "You silly, silly boy," and proceeded to knock the sense out of me, I should say. And I was like, again, 2 years later, I hadn't learned my lesson. Stop messing with second rows. They're much bigger than me. But I can vividly remember my debut with first team in a competitive match, and that was against Cast in the Heineken Cup, and that was an incredible experience. I thrived off it. I was one of those people who just enjoyed the pressure of playing in front of people, and it's something that I just wanted to do for the rest of my career.
It's such a unique environment, isn't it, when you get into elite sport, I think. And I can't speak from experience. I can certainly speak from having experiences last week when I was thinking, what on earth am I doing here? When I was going across a Welsh mountain on a motorbike and it was 4 degrees outside and sleeting. But I wonder, Tom, did you have any idea of the sense of responsibility that you were going to incur as an elite sportsman? You know, was that in your mind when you had this drive to become a professional rugby player right from the start? Were you aware of that, or were you given any coaching to help you with that?
It's a really interesting way of looking at it, and I'd never felt responsibility. And we would talk, but social media, for example, wasn't prevalent in the early 2000s. So it was Facebook just coming into it, sort of 2006, 2007. But apart from that, as rugby players, you could pretty much move about and no one would notice you. Nowadays, of course, you just have to be close to someone with a camera phone and misbehaving slightly, and it just goes everywhere and very, very quickly. So the guys now are definitely presented with a load of opportunity to learn about how to manage those sorts of things. So as when the players go into the academy, for example, there'll be people from the RPA coming in, people from the club coming in, always badgering you to make sure you're just towing the line, behaving, understanding your responsibility as role models. But from a personal perspective, I never went into rugby to inspire other people to play rugby. I went into rugby because I really enjoyed it and I wanted to see how far I could go. And for the majority of players, I suspect that's what they want to do. They want to see how high they can achieve, what is the zenith of their ability, and how far can they push themselves in that period of time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you'd ever come across people who do get fired up by that sense of sort of role model and responsibility. You've ever witnessed that? I
think you look at the likes of, say, a Joe Marler, and he's a very, very interesting character, the England loose head at the moment, and he's a really driven family man, and he understands the positive influence he can have on the people around him and the people who he has effect over. But he's unapologetic in terms of being original about it. Now, he's probably verging on being a bit of a caricature of himself at the minute, but he's unapologetic. He will give so much time to these young people who are striving to become professional sportsmen or just striving to know a professional sportsman. He'll give all of his time, less so to slightly older, sort of the older generations. He's not particularly interested in talking to people. So he's really that person who knows how to use it for his benefit, but it feels slightly uncomfortable doing it, I think. That's probably a good way to put it. But he's a very interesting guy, and he's got some interesting subjects to talk about, and he's certainly got a different perspective than the normal rugby player, I'd say.
He is certainly a unique character, hilarious as well on social media. The clips I've seen of him. Tom, take yourself back to just before that Heineken Cup quarter final in 2009, and what did it mean to you to be part of the Harlequins family?
So I look at it in such a way that I went all in, and I was involved in this environment where we were a very close knit group, almost enforced. Now, going out of that group, now I hardly speak to people from rugby anymore. It's really interesting how, and you may have some different opinions on this from your experiences in the military, but certainly we were thrown together and we had this common goal of trying to be successful and winning down the line. And I just felt totally engrossed in that. And I was as motivated by Harlequins being successful as I was from my own personal perspective. My own personal goal would have been to play for England, to play for the British Lions. But surrounding that, it was the goal of a club to be as successful as possible. For 5 years or 4 years before, we'd been relegated. Dean Richards had come in, and now we're at the quarterfinals of a Heineken Cup against Leinster, the furthest we'd been in this competition. So it was really exciting time to be involved in the club.
I bet. Talk us through that day then, Tom, that quarter final in the Heineken Cup 2009. Talk us through the day, and then tell us how things started to pan out after that.
Yeah, so we were playing Leinster in the Heineken Cup quarter-final, so Leinster being European rugby royalty. And they had success before, and if you can imagine their backline of Brian O'Driscoll, Shane Horgan and the like, it's like pretty, the players that I wanted to test myself against, the players that I thought, right, now's my opportunity. I was on the bench alongside a guy called Chris Malone, an Australian fly half. And as the day transpired, he went on the field as replacement for Nick Evans, who had a little niggle in his ankle or came off through an ankle injury. Now, such as the intricacies of the substitution rules, that Harlequins, as a principle, always marked it. You can mark a substitution card either as tactical or an injury replacement. Now, Nick Evans came off, and it was marked as a tactical replacement. Now, Chris Malone goes on to the field, the reserve fly half. Nick Evans was an All Black. Chris Malone was our second choice fly half, Australian, vastly experienced, excellent player. Now, Chris Malone then tore his hamstring off a bone about 3 minutes later, and I then had to go on. Now, Chris couldn't be marked as a tactical substitution because he got stretchered off. There's no way he would have got away with it. As I was running on the field, Dean Richards, our director of rugby, so head coach, for want of a better term, for those who aren't quite so familiar, said to me, Tom, you're coming off for blood. Tell Steph Brennan. So Steph Brennan was a physio. I look at Dean Richards. Okay, run on the field. As I go past Steph Brennan, I say to Steph Brennan, Steph, Dino says I'm coming off for blood. He looks at me. Okay. I then go about my business. Interestingly, I didn't think a huge amount about it until Steph then came back on the field with a blood capsule, and he handed this blood capsule to me. He handed this blood capsule, I took it, and I said, well, what do I do with this? So having never used one before, he said, put it in your sock, and when you have some contact, chuck it in your mouth and bite down on it. Okay, cool, easy. Didn't occur to me not to do it. Didn't occur to me why they were getting me to come off. I then looked at the sideline and saw Nick Evans, the fly half who'd originally gone off with a niggle to his ankle, but marked as tactical, warming up. So this was a ruse in order to get Nick Evans, a recognised kicker, back on the field, the score being 6-5 to Leinster at the time. And of course, a kick is worth 3 points. I, out of pure clarity, couldn't kick the ball down a steep hill. I wasn't a kicker of a ball, put it that way. I'd have anyone else instead of me. And fast forward 5 or so minutes, I have my first and only contact in the game. I trot off to the back of the field, take the blood capsule out of my sock, put it in my mouth and bite down. It falls out. I'm red-green colourblind, so I'm looking for this thing on the floor. Where is it? Where is it? I pick it up, put it back in my mouth. If you look at the footage, it's on YouTube. It's ridiculous. And then I proceed to stumble off winking on the way off, which alerted everyone to it. Stuart Barnes, the commentator, said the immortal lines from my perspective, because it resonates with me every time I see the clip. It's like, who punched Tom Williams in the mouth? Tom Williams? And then I go off the field. After that, you would have thought, hold on a minute, things aren't quite right. Because we were getting shouted at by the Leinster bench. I got taken into the physiotherapy room by the doctor.
So sorry to interrupt. So the Leinster bench thought something was up, did they?
Because they'd seen it all transpire. They'd seen me go on the field. They'd seen Nick Evans be his knee strapped up or his ankle strapped up. It transpired actually he had he had a crack in his ankle as well. So pretty bad behaviour to get him back on the field. Anyway, That's by the by. He went back on. They'd seen it all transpire. This purple sort of fluid flying out of my mouth, looking nothing like blood. And I'm getting shouting because they realise that we're trying to bring an All Black back onto a field rather than, a 25-year-old guy who can't kick the ball who's playing out of position. We go into the physio room, myself and the doctor, Dr. Wendy Chapman, and lock the door. And the Leinster bench are whacking on the door. Their doctor, their physio are whacking on the door trying to get in. The ERC, the European Rugby Commission, or EPRC, I think they were at the time, were knocking, trying to get in the door. And under the pressure and the stress of the situation, I pressurised the doctor into cutting my lip with a scalpel. So I was saying, you've got to do it, you've got to do it, you've got to do it. And she cut my lip with a scalpel. We took a picture of it. Dean had a post-match interview saying, are you satisfied Tom was injured? And he said it's not the point where he was injured or not. He had a cut in his mouth and he was bleeding, and we had a right to take him off. My conscience is clear on it. The follow-up, we ended up at a hearing because it was ridiculous. You could see it all. It was ridiculous. But in the run-up to this hearing, I was told by Harlequins that the worst that could happen is you'll get a little fine and we'll pay it. So I went along with it thinking, right, this is in the best interest of Harlequins to cover this up, because if they don't, and this is what was being layered on me at the time, if we don't try and cover it up, we could get kicked out of Europe, and that had a lot of ramifications.
That's an amazing story. Thanks, Tom, for sharing that with us. And it's I've got so many thoughts flying around my head at the moment because in many ways you're a victim of groupthink in that story, aren't you? And yet you're also a supporter of common purpose, what we understand. Reese and I, work with every day to make organisations have that wider, higher purpose that's going to bring everyone into a common direction. I guess a question I'd ask you therefore is, from your experience, could you advise people now on maybe detecting the warning signs when that common purpose is about to become toxic groupthink? Can you think back to any of the things you might have seen in Dean Richards' behaviour or anything like that that says right, now's the time to take a pause and check?
Yeah, sure. So Dean was brought into Harlequins to bring a level of grit following our relegation in 2004-2005, and he certainly succeeded. He toughened us up straight away, and we needed it. We needed that harder edge. There's no doubt about that. In fact, I don't think we'd have won the Premiership in 2012 without that level of grit being built upon in the first place, and credit to Dean for having done it. Now, what I'm going to tell you now might make you think that there was another way in which he could have done it. The first training session, he bought an old banger of a car, a Renault 5 or something like that, for argument's sake. And he put it on the field at Wimbledon Common where we were training at the time. And for those who don't know, Wimbledon Common's a massive sort of area. And he made us push it around. Not too hard, you think. Someone was in the car, group of 12, taking it in turns to push the car around a kilometre or maybe a mile at the most. And we got back and thought, yeah, that's not too bad. It's taken us about 7 minutes or so. Got a good run on. No problem at all. He then put a couple of other people in the car and made us do it again. He then put the handbrake on, and being the smart, intelligent rugby players that we were, we pushed on the back windscreen, I should say, and our hands went through and we started getting cuts up our wrists. We then went round again. I think we went round that field about 7 times in total. Handbrake on, foot on the brake, getting longer and longer each time, getting angrier and angrier each time. What he did was unite us. Now, some of the players, it has to be said, loved Dean Richards. Some of us loved to unite about the fact we didn't love Dean Richards. Now, for me, that is the telltale warning sign, and the alarm bell should be ringing straight away when you've got such a divided camp where half of the group are so loyal because they love the guy, the leader, and half a group are so loyal because they are united in trying to prove the leader wrong, or to be accepted by the leader because they're not in the inner circle.
And when you're trying to win something against all the odds, that those two sides of the camp, I suppose, can be quite useful. I mean, recently I talk to people sometimes about the elements of trust. One being empathy. You really like the person, you believe he or she is going to be able to unite. The other thing is that their professional competence, which comes with experience, and the other thing is their integrity and doing the right thing all the time, even when no one's looking. So did you get a feeling when you were pushing that Renault 5 around Wimbledon Common, and that you clearly picked up that there was these two camps? What was your feeling on how you could possibly make that work?
It was almost, it's quite a tough one to answer. I think what united us was our will to win and not be in the position we were in 2 years previous to that point, where we were playing in the Championship and showering in porter cabins down in Cornwall, for example. We wanted to be playing on the top table, and that's what actually united us, that common goal of trying to be successful. So regardless of whether we liked Dean Richards or not, the ultimate goal was the same. We wanted to win on a Saturday. Yeah. And that's how we prepared ourselves to go about trying to be successful, and to, whether it be to prove Dean wrong or just to try and seek his approval. That's what we did.
And Tom, when you were in the changing room after you would come off for blood, just before you asked the doctor to cut your lip, is that what was going through your mind? That, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you just had to get on with this for the sake of winning, for the sake of the team?
Yeah, I mean, it did. There's no better way to put it. It's just this. I felt that's what needed to be done. I knew the pressure was on. People were trying to bang and get in the door. It looked ridiculous while I was walking off the field. I knew there was an element there, but we had to do something to try and make this injury a genuine injury. So that was definitely what was going through my mind. I don't think there was a lot going through my mind, to be honest. I mean, you've got to question that sort of behaviour, but absolutely, it wasn't about self-preservation. It was about what was the best thing for Harlequins.
Yeah. And there was a point at which the position of the club changed, right? Did a 180, and there was an incident at the chairman's house that that kind of changed the course of your life and probably the long-term life of the club. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so as a result of this initial hearing that we got, the point in the story we got to, it was found out that, or it was decided that I was solely responsible for this substitution. They essentially came to the conclusion that I had gone to the Clapham Junction joke shop, I had bought the blood capsule, I had told Dean Richards and Steph Brennan that we would be doing the substitution, and I had manufactured the cover-up. That is what had transpired as a result of that. That was the outcome, of that hearing. So I had a year's ban and no one else had anything. So no one from the club had anything, the physio, the doctor, the other players. It was a year for me. And in the following week, we got a letter from the ERC, the European Rugby Commission, or EPRC, and it had an ultimatum on it. It had 5 questions on this ultimatum, asking the questions because they knew that we were playing up, and they knew that we were covering it up. It was plain and obvious to see. And so they sent me an ultimatum where if I hadn't answered the questions that they sent out, my year would have been increased and my ban would have been increased by a further year. And on these questions, it was along the lines of, did you act alone? Who else was involved? Which other players were involved? Was the doctor involved? What was Dean Richards' role? What was the club's role? So in that week, I was going back and forth, and actually you start to think, right, okay, Tom, you're looking at a 2-year ban. Just come forward and tell the truth. But from my perspective, it wasn't that simple. The club were calling me every day saying, if you do this, we'll be kicked out of Europe. People will lose their jobs. Your friends, so it was very key that they use that sort of language, your friends, not colleagues, would lose, some of them would lose their jobs, and you would impact on their future playing opportunities. They were also offering me money in order to take the ban too. They offered to put me on sabbatical for a year. So they pay some of my mortgage, pay for some of me to go traveling, and guarantee me future employment after rugby. So this was all happening on that side of it. And then all I had to do was fall on my sword. and take the year's ban. On the other side, I come forward and tell the truth. And there are implications of that. The implications to the doctor having taken Hippocratic oath and the physiotherapist. The fact that it might well have an impact on my fellow players, my teammates, my friends. So it all culminated one evening at the director's house in Surrey, where we were sat around a very nice, comfortable living room, I should say. And there was a Harlequins board in there, 13 members, 13 men in that room, 12 of the Harlequins board and their QC. And we were going around in circles. They were laying on thick, saying, if you do this, you'll ruin the club, and so on and so forth. And I'm just there, really ill, and talking about mental health earlier, Jerry. Back then, I didn't realize what I was going through, but I had lost a couple of stone in weight. I was stressed. I wasn't sleeping. I was miserable, crying at the most random of things. Stuff that affects me to this day was going through my mind. And I was there with my girlfriend at the time, Alex, and we were going around for maybe 4 or 5 hours because this was the day before the deadline, before I had to answer these questions or not. And Alex stepped out just to get some air because she was getting frustrated. And I used that as my opportunity to bury my head in the sand or to run, whichever way you want to put it. I was like, we're not getting anywhere. I'm going home. I'll let you know my decision in the morning. And as I walk out, Alex says to me, where are you going? We're not finished yet. I said, what do you mean? So I'm going back in. And I'm like, what do you mean you're going back in? You know, you have 13 high-powered businessmen in there, successful men who were in charge of a rugby club. What can you say as a 25-year-old girl that will make a difference? She goes, I'm just going back in. I'm not done. We're not leaving here yet. We haven't got an outcome. So Alex went back in without me on her own to this room of men, and came back out 15 minutes later. And I said, well, what did you say? And then she said, well, I asked them 2 questions. I said, is it Tom's fault we're in this position? Whose fault is it? Fast forward about 12 hours, and 6 o'clock the following morning, the Friday morning, I get a phone call from the Harlequins owner saying, we've accepted Dean Richards' resignation and we apologise, and we would like to support you through telling the truth for the rest of through the subsequent period. So what that took was just Alex making him realise it was bigger than Harlequins.
Tom, thank you so much for telling that story. And that particular story, in for me, it highlights a couple of things. You've brilliantly described how, you know, as a young man in that situation, you didn't really know how this was impacting upon you in terms of your mental health. And you've really, I can't commend you enough for A, having come to terms with that, and B, being prepared to talk about it, because it's a fantastic lesson. But I think the other thing it highlights is the only person you had batting for you in that room was Alex, and you know, that's an incredibly stressful situation. So that's the first thing. I'm assuming that was the only person that you had supporting you, and sometimes it takes someone who's completely outside the situation to look at it from a different perception and get the message across. So that's fantastic. And the other thing I wanted to sort of highlight was that the club faced what we would describe as a tension between the short-term reputational gain of winning and the long-term reputational loss of cheating. And you know, I think what you've done is enable the club to have that long-term reputational reinforcement. And you know, so brilliant story, and I hope you continue to tell it. But what was it? How did you feel about Alex having done that? Having jumped in there from her perspective and being able to turn the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think what she provided was that cognitive diversity to be able to go into a room and perspective from someone who wasn't entirely engrossed in the future of it. So Harlequins were looking after themselves at this point. If they were really looking after themselves, and if they'd had their time again, they'd have put their hands up, said, yeah, we made a mistake, sorry. Yeah. Then we'd have probably got, I don't know, kicked out of Europe for the rest of the game, for the rest of the season, maybe a small fine, and it would have been brushed over. Fair play, Harlequins put their hands up. But what they did by trying to continually cover it up is really dig that hole deeper and deeper and deeper. And they were trying to get themselves out of this hole. And they were thinking about doing it by bribing me. Now it's getting worse and worse. This is just, you couldn't make up a story like this because people wouldn't believe it. And it took Alex's outside perspective, someone who worked in recruitment at the time, to go, hold on a minute. Yeah, have any of you considered the impact this is having on Tom? Are any of you aware that this guy is not well and he is miserable, and you're killing him ultimately. If it had gone on for too much longer, who knows? I dread to think. But that element of alternative thinking in the room suddenly made them realize, humanized me to the extent it was like, oh my God, we're doing the wrong thing. Until that point, they weren't thinking about the other option. They didn't think they had another option. They thought the only option they had was trying to get away with it, or to make me take the fall, because that would be the best thing for Harlequins.
Because they're looking in the short term. The short term is the next year or something like that. But here we are, a few years down the road now, and Harlequins has a great reputation. And,
exactly. And if they thought about it, actually, that £1 or £1.50 blood capsule ended up costing Harlequins over £1 million.
Wow.
So whereas if they just put their hands up and said, no, we've messed up here, then probably Dean would have stayed, I'd have stayed, which I did subsequently, but everyone would have stayed in their roles. But it would just been a little bit of a slap on the wrist, and the game would have been cleaned up as a result.
When Jerry and I and our colleagues speak to leadership teams now, it's easy for an organization, even if there is a bit of diversity in the room, it's easy for this escalation of commitment to almost spiral out of control and take on a life of its own, and you end up down a course of action which is far from optimal. And dare I say, within that room, Tom, do you think that to the last man, they all truly believed in the course of action that they had proposed to you? Or do you think there were some people who actually privately thought, this is just plain wrong, and they needed that catalyst, that intervention from Alex to kind of tip them over the edge?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think this director, it's important to mention this, a guy called Roger Looker. I went to school with his son, so we had a relationship beyond Harlequins. And I suspect, and I have never actually asked Alex about who responded or how they responded in that room. Never asked that question. I should probably do that. And I suspect it was Alex coming in and making them realize that I was a person. But was the catalyst that made the change for those people who couldn't quite speak up, because there's some dominant figureheads in that room who probably didn't know the full story and the full background of it, and also were getting swept along with the "you'll get kicked out of Europe, it will be ruined" argument that they were saying to me. They were peddling to me as well.
What for you changed at the club after that? Now, I know you went on to win the Premiership a couple of seasons later, so clearly things changed and good things started to happen. But how did it feel to be part of the club for you specifically and for the other players?
It was pretty tough afterwards, because the full story never really came out. I did a podcast last year with Ugo Monia and Danny Kerr, who were my teammates at Harlequins at the time. And we discussed stuff on that podcast on the 10-year anniversary of Bloodgate that they'd never heard and they weren't aware of. And I think Ugo came out and said we'd have all done it in the same position, or Danny said it. I'm not sure which one of them said it. And that was really interesting for me, because I remember going back following my ban, and I remember training with the group, half of them hating me, the loyal Dean people hating me, and half of them not really understanding or trusting me. So even though they liked me as their friend, they just had that element of, hold on a minute, he didn't fall on his sword. So there was a certain element of mistrust there. What Harlequins did do subsequently was employ Conor O'Shea, who had history within rugby, but also history outside of rugby. Someone who had perspective beyond the game, which was really, really important. And one of the first things he asked me to do was stand up in front of a group at an away day at Ashridge Business School. And at this, he said, look, well, you can say what you want, but you might want to apologise. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. You want me to apologise? And he goes, oh, no, not necessarily apologise. So I stuttered over his words a bit. So don't worry, I'll speak. So I got up and I said, I'm not going to make any apologies for a decision I made. I did what I thought was best in the best interest of my family, myself, and I did what I thought was right. And I'm sorry if you don't like that. And I think from that, a lot of respect was gained, even though there might not have been trust between me and the other players for a long time after that.
Yeah, and goodness me, Tom, we've really dissected that story, and I really thanks so much for sticking with it. And the lessons I've got from that are, this psychological safety that you need in an organisation to allow people to voice up against a perceived position of overemphasized authority is really, really important. And that how Alex managed to turn the room for you in that is a great example of that, which I think a lot of organisations face as well. And I think this long-term reputation thing as well. You've done a fantastic thing, and as I've seen as a fan, rugby evolve in so many ways in the last last 5 to 10 years. With the great work in diversity, and this is a critical part of that story, because people hold the game in such high regard, in comparison to other games we could mention. And I can only commend you for what you've done. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. But perhaps if I could ask, what's next for you? What's in the future, and how are you going to take these lessons and help others with it?
Well, it's that element of psychological safety is really, really important, isn't it? It's all very well saying to people that you should have environments like this, but actually having those environments is another step altogether. And that's part of what I do. So I go into companies now and I deliver training programs based on high performance culture and compliance, predominantly to FCA regulated businesses, where I'll go in and I'll spend about 3 hours dissecting the Bloodgate story, how non-financial misconduct can lead to financial misconduct. So I draw the parallels between what we were doing off the pitch, pushing Renault 5s around, getting drunk all the time, misbehaving, and how that transferred to on-field behaviour. And that's how I draw the parallels using the Bloodgate story. I use an industry-specific expert to come in and provide some context, but will actually justify it as a training program. But so that's what I'm doing in the background. And also, I'll tell my story and try and make it relevant to the audience that I hear. My favourite thing is to go into schools and try and help them avoid the pitfalls that I fell into, to try and have a voice, to try and stand up. And actually, what I'm seeing from the current generation coming through is that they are more prepared to do so. Whether you call it the entitlement that they are unfairly assigned to them at some point, this entitlement, but it does give them the entitlement to stand up. And that's what I encourage them to do.
What a great mission to be on there, Tom. I think it's such a unique story. I can't think of a parallel anywhere outside of the kind of Jordan Belfort, Wolf of Wall Street example. But yours is so unique, and you tell it so well. So really thank you for coming on and sharing it with us. Where can people find out more about you and your organisation now?
Sure, I'm on LinkedIn. My organisation is called TMW Development, imaginatively named, I should say. And yeah, I'm on social media. So Tom Williams, Progress Coach on LinkedIn. If you search for that, it should come up. And the company's called TMW Development. And I'm working on getting it a bit more social media savvy at the moment. It's one of those things that keep continually trying to improve on.
Good.
Fantastic. It's been one of the things, the reason I put this podcast together for, as you'll hear when it comes out, is the fact that at T in the military, it was the place where people shared stories, and the power of stories to teach lessons is often much greater than the lessons themselves, and the way you do that. So T is where that was always done in the military, and the story you've told is just fantastic, and I know it will be of benefit to others when they hear it. So many thanks again. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to meet you.
Thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed it.
Good stuff. Tom, thanks for coming on. And from Jerry and I, thank you all for listening to Tea and Medals. See you next time.